Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. Today we'll be looking at the sections The Chairs of Virtue and of the Afterworldsmen in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So in these sections we'll first be looking at the psychology of the virtuous individual and the idea of virtuous individual wanting to get a good sleep and good night's sleep and the problems with that. And then we'll be having a look at the psychology of people who create the ideas of the afterlife and believe in the ideas of the afterlife. What's the psychological profiling of those people? So let's get rolling. Of the chairs of virtue. Zarathustra had heard a wise man praised who was said to discourse well on sleep and virtue. He was greatly honoured and rewarded for it, and all the young men sat before his chair. Zarathustra went to him and sat before his chair with all the young men, and thus spoke the wise man, "Honour to sleep and modesty before it. This is the first thing, and avoid all those who sleep badly and are awake at night. Even the thief is shamed when confronted with sleep. He always steals softly through the night. But shameless is the night watchman, shamelessly he bears his horn. Sleeping is no mean art. You need to stay awake all day to do it. You must overcome yourself 10 times a day. That causes a fine weariness and is opium to the soul. 10 times you must be reconciled to yourself again, for overcoming is bitterness, and the unreconciled man sleeps badly. You must discover 10 truths a day. Otherwise, you will seek truth in the night too, with your soul still hungry. You must laugh and be cheerful 10 times a day, or your stomach, that father of affliction, will disturb you in the night. Few know it, but one must have all the virtues in order to sleep well. Shall I bear false witness? Shall I commit adultery? Shall I covet my neighbour's maidservant? None of this would be consistent with a good sleep. And when one has all the virtues, there is still one thing to remember, to send even these virtues to sleep at the proper time, that they may not quarrel among themselves, the pretty little woman, and over you, unhappy man. Peace with God and with your neighbour, thus good sleep will have it, and peace too with your neighbour's devil, otherwise he will haunt you at night. Honour and obedience to the authorities, and even to the crooked authorities, thus good sleep will have it. How can I help it that power likes to walk on crooked legs? I shall always call him the best herdsman who leads his sheep to the greenest meadows, that accords with good sleep. I do not desire much honour, nor a great treasure. They excite spleen, but one sleeps badly without a good name and a small treasure. The company of a few is more welcome to me than bad company, but they must come and go at the proper time, that accords with good sleep. The poor in spirit too please me greatly. They further sleep. Blessed and happy they are indeed, especially if one always agrees with their views. Thus for the virtuous man does the day pass, and when night comes I take good care not to summon sleep. He, the Lord of virtues, does not like to be summoned. But I remember what I have done and thought during the day. Ruminating, I asked myself, patient as a cow, what were your 10 overcomings? And which were the 10 reconciliations and the 10 truths and the 10 fits of laughter with which my heart enjoyed itself? As I ponder such things, rocked by my 40 thoughts, sleep, the Lord of virtue, suddenly overtakes me uncalled. Sleep knocks on my eyes, they grow heavy. Sleep touches my mouth, it stays open. Truly he comes to me on soft soles, the dearest of thieves, and steals my thoughts from me. I stand as silent as this chair, but I do not stand for long. Already I am lying down. So Nietzsche is here commenting on the way in which virtue and being virtuous is to ultimately do battle with oneself and one's bodily desires. And to be a virtuous person is to have a good night's sleep. That is without worry, without any consequence or repercussion of your actions, and therefore you're going to have a nice peaceful sleep and ultimately be able to have a nice great life on top of that as well. And an example we've got here is a good one. Shall I commit adultery? Shall I covet my neighbour's maidservant? So of course this is talking about the virtue of chastity and being chaste. And the extreme of that example, of course, is through our bodily desire and sexual drive and the need to reproduce and procreate and so forth. It's saying there we need to get control over it, because if we don't, we'll suddenly want to be adulterous. And how do you get control over it? You be chaste, you abstain, and then we have the complete opposite example of that, and where abstinence is argued to be the better way to do things, because then we'll have complete control over our body and our sexual drive rather than allowing us to be dominated by it. And a great immediate point here as well for criticism would be, well, what is Nietzsche going to be saying here? Is adultery perfectly acceptable? It should suddenly be adulterous and therefore give in to our bodily desires, and because that's a positive thing, just to be completely excessive and completely promiscuous? The reply to that is no. What Nietzsche is highlighting here is rather that we have a problem in the virtuous individual, and what Nietzsche is highlighting is the anxiety, stress, and worry of being virtuous at all given times by wanting that good sleep. And so there's that irony then of wanting a good sleep, but at the same time not being able to have a good sleep because you're in that constant state of worry, of thinking of, are you doing the right actions all the time? Are you doing the right thing? Am I being good? And instead of leading to this state of well-being, it has a really incredibly negative psychological effect overall, an effect on our mental health. And here you can be precisely more critical of views like complete abstinence altogether, because in Nietzsche's view here, you would have that sense of complete paranoia and way in which someone wants to be close to another individual or be intimate with another person, and then at every given instance thinking to themselves that what they're doing is wrong. And of course that's not what you want to get to whatsoever, because when you're with someone and you want to be intimate, that is not a wrong thing whatsoever. It's perfectly fine. It's completely natural. It's all part of our bodily instincts, all just at work. Well, does that mean that we are wanting to go and commit adultery and covet thy neighbour's maidservant? He says, no, of course not. But that also doesn't mean to say that we should just outright deny our bodily desires altogether and view them as a completely negative thing. Because if we do so, then we remain in this sleep-like state. We ultimately have this dream-like world in which we don't ever want to be awake. Because if then we're awake, then we're paranoid, then we suddenly negate everything around us, and we have a complete horrible experience with everything that we think about, or everything we do, and every relationship we have with people. And so, on a deeper level, what's happening as well is that Nietzsche is really saying that in virtue ethics, which is based upon repetition, in order for us to create a habit to control our behavior, that very mode of repeating and thinking about things is incredibly harmful for us, leads us to deny our bodily desires, makes us think about ourselves in a horrible way. So continuing on then, when Zarathustra heard the wise man's words, he laughed in his heart, for through them a light had dawned upon him, and he spoke thus to his heart. This wise man with his 40 thoughts seems to me a fool, but I believe he knows well enough how to sleep. Happy is he who lives in this wise man's neighborhood. Such sleep is contagious, even through a thick wall. A spell dwells even in his chair, and the young men have not sat in vain before the preacher of virtue. His wisdom is stay awake in order to sleep well. And truly, if life had no sense, and I had to choose nonsense, this would be the most desirable nonsense for me too. Now it is clear to me what people were once seeking above all when they sought teachers of virtue. They sought good sleep and opium virtues to bring it about. To all of these lauded wise men of academic chairs, wisdom meant sleep without dreams. They knew no better meaning of life. And today, too, there are some like this preacher of virtue, and not always so honourable. But their time is up, and they shall not stand for much longer. They are already lying down. Blessed are these drowsy men, for they soon shall drop off. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And here we have the relation into having this sleep-like state being contagious and back into this herd-like mentality, and its relation into organized religion and the way in which it teaches us to be virtuous, but in doing so we ultimately are in this sleep-like state, completely negating the world and the body. And so we can have this great image from the movie The Matrix, in which you have Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, who wakes up from this virtual reality world called The Matrix. And when he wakes up, he looks and sees that everybody is asleep and plugged in to these big, massive machines, because ultimately in the movie, humans are used like batteries for the machines or robots who've ultimately taken over everything. And it's precisely that image, like fantastic one from the movie, of everybody in these chambers, completely hairless, not actually experiencing the real world, not actually experiencing anything at all, but just ultimately being in this sleep-like state. And these chambers you can have is like what Nietzsche paints the picture of for what type of person we're going to end up with, and what type of experience can we expect out of it is something that's really horrible. And we have this interesting relation to virtue ethics being like an opium, being like a drug for the body and drug for your mind as well. And it's again to touch upon that similar point as well, in which it wants you to be in this complete passive state of things, completely accepting, not doing anything at all. And it's interesting when you have this image of being like a drug, because then we have, maybe becoming virtuous as a person and the idea of becoming good is like, in a way, taking a good drug or getting a good kick, thinking you're being a good person, and you get a sense of being high on that sense of doing good and being good. But at the same time, you've got that kickback of actually what you think you're doing good is incredibly harmful for you in a psychological sense of it, because the amount of paranoia that's at work. And it's in a sense like a drug addict as well. What you think is what you're doing good is actually having that incredibly negative side effects, and you need help. And what Nietzsche's saying is what way in which we need to get help for the way in which we're thinking about things is to get away from this move towards this paranoid state in which we view our own body. Of the Afterworldsmen. Once Zarathustra too cast his deluded fancy beyond mankind, like all Afterworldsmen. Then the world seemed to me the work of a suffering and tormented god. Then the world seemed to me the dream and fiction of a god, coloured vapour before the eyes of a discontented god. Good and evil, and joy and sorrow, and I knew I thought them coloured vapour before the Creator's eyes. The Creator wanted to look away from himself, so he created the world. It is intoxicating joy for the sufferer to look away from his suffering and to forget himself. Intoxicating joy and self-forgetting. That is what I once thought the world. This world, the eternally imperfect, the eternal and imperfect image of a contradiction, an intoxicating joy to its imperfect creator. That is what I once thought the world. Thus, I too once cast my deluded fancy beyond mankind, like all afterworldsmen, beyond mankind in reality. Ah, brothers, this God which I created was human work and human madness, like all gods. He was human and only a poor piece of man in ego. This phantom came to me from my own fire and ashes. That is the truth. It did not come to me from the beyond. So Nietzsche is here touching upon creationism and God as a creator of the world, the theory, where you have God as a being that is completely perfect, completely pure, creating the world which is in itself a reflection of God that is completely perfect and pure. And then there's also that famous example we have as well, in which you have the watchmaker and the watch in theory, in which you have such a beautiful way in which it functions. There has to be a creator of the watch. For the way in which we think about the world is far too beautiful in the way it functions and the way it operates. There had to be a creator for the world. And Nietzsche here says that's the way in which you can think about things, but only if you forget about our own suffering, our own bodily desires, and all the horrors of the world as well, life and death struggle that goes on a constant daily basis. And then comes the good argument as well. If the world is therefore imperfect, because it's flawed, because we're flawed as creations, because we die and are prone to disease and so forth, then how come a creator who is completely perfect made us who are imperfect? And Nietzsche touched upon that point. Well, that's because God is not pure. God is not this absolute transcendent thing. In fact, God is a human creation. And this point is not original to Nietzsche, but rather is a point that's argued for by another philosopher called Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote and argued for this in his book called The Essence of Christianity, which was written in 1841. And Nietzsche's point is, well, as you can see, the way in which we create gods in order to understand the world, and the way in which gods themselves are reflections of our own humanity, in a way in which gods themselves are not pure, transcendent beings. And so you don't have to. And the problem is we get so fixed upon this idea of monotheism that we focus upon just solely one absolute God. We think about all the different types of religions that there are, and within history as well, the different types of gods that there were. And you can go to ancient Greece's example of the Olympian gods, and when you get in there as an idea, you have not these pure, transcendent, absolute beings, they're all hunky-dory. Then you get in there and you go, well, it's like a Jerry Springer episode for the amount of things that's going on with them. Or a Jeremy Kyle episode for here in the UK. And you take an example of, let's say, Zeus. And Zeus is a big, massive adulterer in the whole Greek mythos of things. And then Hera, who's the queen of the gods, goes in a big, massive, spiteful rage for all the adulteresses that Zeus has ultimately had it off with. Continuing on. What happened, my brothers? I, the sufferer, overcame myself. I carried my own ashes to the mountains. I made for myself a brighter flame, and behold, the phantom fled from me. Now to me, the convalescent, it would be suffering and torment to believe in such phantoms. It would be suffering to me now and humiliation. Thus I speak to the afterworldsmen. It was suffering and impotence that created all afterworlds, and that brief madness of happiness that only the greatest sufferer experiences. Weariness which wants to reach the ultimate with a single leap, with a death leap. A poor, ignorant weariness which no longer wants to even want, that created all gods and afterworlds. Believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despised of the body, that touched the ultimate walls with the fingers of its deluded spirit. Believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despaired of the earth, that heard the belly of being speak to it. And then it wanted to get its head through the ultimate walls, and not its head only, over into the other world, but that other world, that inhuman, dehumanized world, which is a heavenly nothing, is well hidden from men, and the belly of being does not speak to man, except as man. Truly, all being is hard to demonstrate, it is hard to make it speak. Yet tell me, brothers, is not the most wonderful of all things most clearly demonstrated? And so we have then Nietzsche creating a psychological profile of people who create an afterlife, which is in itself strange, because we initially think of afterlife and things that are argued within a religious context as that of being reasoned and having proofs within things, and from those proofs they either exist or they don't. But with this psychological profiling, Nietzsche is ultimately showing, well, their arguments in themselves are based upon a certain type of person and their mentality and how they're thinking about things and thinking about the world. And from that profile, we can understand why they reach the conclusions that they do, and that this logical argument isn't in itself pure. And who ultimately are the people who created the idea of an afterlife? What is this psychological profile? It is those people who are despisers of the body and the world, who ultimately have this death leap, as Nietzsche says, this leap from the world into an afterlife. And another philosopher who talks about this leap that we've got to take is Søren Kierkegaard. He's very much famous for this idea of the leap, in which Kierkegaard argues that in order to believe in God, we have to have this leap in our reasoning and judgment and move into the absurd. And through leaping, we have this movement into faith. And from this, we can see precisely the power of faith, because Kierkegaard says there is no proof for the existence of God. But Nietzsche argues that this leap is essentially a death leap, because it moves us from the world, which is a living thing, into an unnatural, dead thing of the afterlife. And when he says it's people who have despised the body and the world, an example of that is Socrates. In Plato's Phaedo, we can see Socrates is an old man who Nietzsche argues is very much tired of life and is quite happily willing to drink the hemlock at that point. And everything that he talks about the soul, is all from a man who's reached this old age who just wants to die. And from this we can see Nietzsche's point that the popularity in history for people who's arguing for this whole afterlife is ultimately we've popularized and love people in almost a very macabre way, because we love the very people who say to us not to love life, not to love the world, but precisely the opposite of that. Continuing on, yes, this ego, with its contradiction and confusion, speaks most honestly of its being, this creating, willing, evaluating ego, which is the measure and value of things. And this most honest being, the ego, it speaks of the body, and it insists upon the body, even when it fables and fabricates and flutters with broken wings. Ever more honestly it learns to speak, the ego, and the more it learns, the more it finds titles and honors for the body and the earth. My ego taught me a new pride. I teach it to men, no longer to bury the head in the sand of heavenly things, but to carry it freely an earthly head which creates meaning for the earth. I teach mankind a new will, to desire this path that men have followed blindly, and to call it good, and no more to creep aside from it like the sick and dying. It was the sick and dying who despised the body and the earth, and invented things of heaven and the redeeming drops of blood. But even these sweet and dismal poisons they took from the body and the earth. They wanted to escape from their misery, and the stars were too far for them. Then they sighed, "Oh, if only there were heavenly paths by which to creep into another existence and into happiness." Then they contrived for themselves their secret ways and their draughts of blood. Now they thought themselves transported from their bodies and from this earth, these ingrates. Yet to what do they owe the convulsion and joy of their transport? To their bodies and to this earth. So we then have Nietzsche's view come out, and to no surprise, it's going to be one that focuses upon the body and the world, and criticizing this focus on the afterlife. And what has allowed him to reach this view, of course, is what he says is the ego, this notion of the self that arrives. And what does this allow us to do? It enables us to have a measurement of judgment that allows us to will, create, and evaluate. And so we have the initial basic thing of having our own likes and dislikes that we all have within what our body teaches us, of course. Some people like dark chocolate, other people like milk chocolate, and so on. And that all allows us to develop our idea of what taste is and our own subjectivity through all that. And where do you get all the things that you like and enjoy, of course, is from the earth, because for chocolate especially, you're going to have to get it from people who've manufactured it from cocoa beans and so on. Where that enjoyment doesn't come from is a metaphysical plane, an otherworldly place. And it's also that point of, well, how can you enjoy what you can never taste as well? Because what are they going to try to say that is good for you, that you are going to enjoy, is going to be, like what we said previously as well, this view of the afterlife that Nietzsche sees here is poisonous. If you were to actually try and put it down into a substance and form, it goes back into that idea of Socrates and the hemlock and enjoying poison and something that's poisonous for us. And of course we have got that immediate reaction of our body and of course our reason as well, to say, would we actually drink that willingly? Think about the type of person that would drink that. Don't we think that there is a problem with this view of things? And then of course we have the irony. These people who argue for the afterlife, what do they owe their enjoyment for in the first place? Where does all their pleasure come from? Precisely from their own bodies and from the world. And so they're complete ingrates, as Nietzsche says, because everything that they've enjoyed in the world comes from that world, from their experiences. And the irony is, of course, they're saying, no, actually, there is no pleasure at all in what they've experienced or in the world. Continuing on then, wrapping up this little section. Zarathustra is gentle with the sick. Truly, he is not angry at their manner of consolation and ingratitude. May they become convalescents and overcomers and make for themselves a higher body. Neither is Zarathustra angry with the convalescent if he glances tenderly at his illusions and creeps at midnight around the grave of his god. But even his tears still speak to me of sickness and a sick body. There have always been many sickly people among those who invent fables and long for God. They have a raging hate for the enlightened man and for the youngest of virtues, which is called honesty. They are always looking back to the dark ages. Then, indeed, illusion and faith were a different question. Raving of the reason was a likeness to God, and doubt was sin. I know these godlike people all too well. They want to be believed in, and doubt to be sin. I also know all too well what it is they themselves most firmly believe in. Truly not in afterworlds and redeeming drops of blood, they believe most firmly in the body, and their own body is for them their thing in itself, but is a sickly thing to them, and they would dearly like to get out of their skins. This is why they hearken to preachers of death and themselves preach afterworlds. Listen rather, my brothers, to the voice of the healthy body. This is a purer voice and a more honest one. Purer and more honest of speech is the healthy body. Perfect and square built, it speaks of the meaning of the earth. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And so, wrapping up the section, we have Nietzsche criticize organized religion, or people within a sort of fundamentalist viewpoint that take the word as is and is absolute and are completely against any idea of calling into question what's said in the scripture. And as he says, what they want is it to go back to the Dark Ages, where to doubt was to sin, to call into question the scripture or the word of God was ultimately to commit blasphemy. And of course we can go into an example here of witchcraft and the witch trials, in which you would have precisely those women who are accused of being witches and have the scripture basically thrown at them, and where you would have also any semblance of a counter argument would be thrown out of the window. And so Nietzsche highlights then the contradiction as well about believing completely in the scripture, but he says what they of course believe in most firmly is their own body. We can get into the historical examples we have. And within the Catholic Church, there's the idea of indulgences, where you would pay a fee in order for your sin to be forgiven. And this, of course, led to Martin Luther famously writing the 95 Theses in 1517 against Pope Leo X. And a contemporary example is from the evangelical church, with the ideas of the mega church and all the accumulation of money, the vast sums of wealth that the mega churches collect, and the ministers and so forth running around on the private jets. But that's what Nietzsche is saying here as well, is that, well, if they practice what they preached, why do they need so much money in the first place? Is because precisely they believe in their body as well, and to treat their bodies as a great thing, and to indulge in pleasures of the world. But through their conditioning, of course, is while they see their own body as a sickly thing and want out of it, despite wanting pleasure from the world and pleasure from their own body, and hence why they preach the ideas of the afterlife and of death. And Zarathustra's idea of the body, of course, is the idea of the one that which we're born with, something that's healthy, perfect, and square built, as he says. It already runs good straight from the get-go. We don't need this horrible ideological stuff that we have spouted to us from a religious sphere of things, because that'll ultimately make us view things in a sickly way. And we need to get away from all that. We need to view things a much more healthy way, and one that views our natural body as healthy. Thank you very much for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my little chat about the sections on the chairs of virtue and of the Afterworldsmen. In the next episode, we will continue to read through Nietzsche's Zarathustra. In the meantime, you can reach me via email, and feel free to drop me a wee question at dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I could be also found on Twitter at I am a rubber man. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you join us next time.